I'd like to welcome to the stage our inaugural director for the SNF Agora Institute, Hahrie, a Harvard and Stanford educated scholar who has dedicated her career to understanding political and civic participation and engagement, and who strives to find a way to make her academic work relevant in the world beyond campus, one of the critical pillars of the Agora Institute. Hahrie truly embodies the values that our institute aspires to promote. She's known not only for her excellence in scholarship, but also for her work and practice in Washington and beyond. And most importantly, she's known for her boundless energy, her strategic vision, and the exceptional collegiality that marks everything she does. She is exactly the right leader at exactly the right time for this important initiative. I could go on to list all the groups she works with, the committees she steers, and the accolades she's garnered, but I think we'd rather just hear from her now. And so I'm pleased to welcome Hahrie to the stage to kick off this program, to tell you a little more about her research, and to share her vision for the work ahead for the SNF Agora Institute. Thank you.
Good morning. Come on, friends. I think we can do better than that. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here with you all this morning. I want to start just by thanking Andreas and the whole team at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making today possible, and really the entire week of activities that we've all been here today. I also want to give a special thanks to Elizabeth Smythe and also Carol Glagola, who have both worked tirelessly, not only in the past couple of weeks, but throughout the year to make possible the events and the panels of today. They really deserve all the credit for all the work and the discussions that we're going to have. And most of all, I want to thank all of you who are here this morning. I know some of you had a late night last night, and so I appreciate you waking up this morning and coming out to join us here this morning for really, I think, what really will be an extension of a lot of the stimulating and thought-provoking conversations that we've heard over the past couple days. It's particularly relevant that we're here today before the gathered here in Athens, right close to the ancient Agora, which is really the birthplace of modern democracy. And I want to return to why the Agora is so relevant to the conversations that we're going to have today. But I'd rather start by telling you a little bit of a story to introduce you a little bit to myself. So I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas, and I grew up in a very kind of vibrant, multiracial, multi-ethnic immigrant community. And like many kids of immigrants, I grew up learning how to sort of bridge difference with people who are different from me. And I want to tell you about one of my friends, my friend Kelly. So Kelly and I have been friends together since we were 6 years old. We first became friends when our first grade teacher, Miss Ruska, suggested that we sit next to each other because she thought that we might be friends. And little did Miss Ruska know how accurate she would be. Kelly and I grew up, we shared sleepovers, play dates, birthday parties, all the things that kids do. We pulled each other's hair, we dressed up for Halloween, we went to the annual Texas rodeo together. And even though we went to different colleges, we never really lost touch. So Kelly was a maid of honor at my wedding, I was a maid of honor at her wedding, and most recently we flew across the country to sort of share our birthdays, our 40th birthdays together. And I tell you this story because even though Kelly and I grew up sharing a lot of things together, we've always disagreed politically. So when we were younger, we used to, in fact, make lists of things that we shared. We both have short moms. We both hate spaghetti. We both love to read. We both hate practicing piano. Apparently, we can't spell practicing very well, so neither of us were very good spellers when we were younger. But we always kind of had these things that we had in common, but also things that we disagreed about. And so after college, my first job was working for a Democratic senator in New Jersey, Bill Bradley. And I had the privilege of working not only on his presidential campaign in 2000, but on the Obama campaign in 2008 and on the Obama-Biden transition team in 2009. And I remember going to visit Kelly in Virginia when I was working on the transition team. Kelly, meanwhile, took a very different path. After college, she went to work for an electronics company called Circuit City, and then she became a CPA, and now works for a big energy company in Virginia. And when we were younger, we used to sort of spend time on the phone kind of working out our political views together. So I'm sure some of you will remember those old phone cords that used to get twisted up all the time when you talked, and my kids can't imagine them, but I remember lying on my bedroom floor, kind of twisted up in the phone cord, debating with Kelly about different political topics. And to me, this story is particularly relevant to the conversation that we're having today because it really sets up the panel, about talking and listening across divides. Because statistically speaking, the kind of friendship that Kelly and I have is not as common now as it used to be when I was younger. So data from the Pew Research Center shows us that Americans on both sides of the political aisle are increasingly likely to see people from the other side as a threat. Right? So imagine what it's like to see the people around you as a very threat to your country. And I look at this data and I sort of think, I wonder if I had met Kelly now as opposed to when we were kids 20 years ago or 30 years ago, would we see each other as threats, right? Would we focus on our common humanity, spaghetti, piano, books, things that brought us together, or would we focus on the things that really drove us apart? And one of the things I think that is so important to thinking about this conversation is that when Kelly and I were friends, as we were learning to sort of grow up together, we never obscured our differences. We never ignored our differences under the guise of some kind of false civility or anything like that. Instead, we were as clear about what we disagreed about as what we shared, right? Because it was through that sort of conversation that we learned to negotiate a friendship out of what we both had in common and what we disagreed about. And that brings me back to the Agora. We cannot really talk about the rise in affective polarization and parochialism around the world without thinking about the Agora. And the reason for that is because the Agora laid a crucial foundation for democracy and making modern democracy possible. And so why was it so crucial? So to understand why it was so crucial, I want to draw on the work of a Stanford political theorist, Josiah Ober, who talks about that answering this question about why the Agora was so crucial to democracy depends first on understanding what democracy is. So often nowadays, people have begun to think about democracy as majority rule, right? It's a voting rule that helps us decide what we want to do together. And he argues that democracy actually wasn't just about voting rule and its original conceptions, right? Instead, if you go, those of you who speak Greek don't need me to tell you that, democracy is really the composite of two words, demoskratia, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, right? But when put together, it means people power. And power in that original sense was about the capacity of people to act. Right? So when we think about democracy in its original formulation, it was about sort of the capacity of people to act together. And that's why the Agora was so important, because the Agora was a place where people came together to develop the capacities to learn to act together in the ways that they needed to make democracy work. And so what's so interesting about Ober's work is that what he finds is that, Athens was sort of one of many kind of little political experiments that were going on across classical Greece, where there are all sorts of different experiments for how we sort of structure democracy. And on most measures of society, the Athenian democracy did quite well. Socially, politically, economically, militarily, it was really quite successful. And Josiah Ober argues that the success came not only as by accident, right? It wasn't just an outlier, but instead it was really grounded in choices that Athens had made about how they wanted to design their governmental system, how they wanted to sort of use the Agora as a foundation for making that government work. And that part of what differentiated Athenian democracy from other city-states around classical Greece was the fact that it had this Agora, right? And was the fact that it had this place where people came together, where people who were different and learned how to disagree with each other, and there was a structured forum for debate and deliberation through which we could form the capacities that then made the kind of governance possible. And so as we confront all the threats to democracy around the world today, threats that you don't really need me to rehearse, and we think about this challenge of identifying, strengthening, and developing solutions to dealing with those challenges, I think the question that the Agora really poses for us is, what choices can we make now in the 21st century to realize democracy's promise? Right? What are the choices that we can make about how we want to design the spaces, the agora-like spaces and the institutions that we have to make possible the democracy that we want? And so that question, or a form of that question, has really been in the backdrop of my work for many years. So my work has always been dedicated to trying to understand how we make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful. So I've always wanted to understand, how is it that we pull people off the sidelines of public life? Right? How is it that we cultivate their interests, their motivations, their desires to want to engage with each other? And then finally, how do we make that matter? Right? Democracy is not just about people taking action, but it's about people taking action in a way that actually allows them to have voice over the outcomes that they care about. And so most of my work has been in the United States. Having grown up as a daughter of immigrants, I think that I was always really interested in this whole idea of America, right? What is this thing called America, and how does it work? And so I've dedicated my work to understanding a lot of organizations in that space, but I've had the privilege of being able to do the work in partnership with organizations all over the world, from environmental organizations in the United States to an evangelical church in the Rust Belt of Ohio, trying to understand how it is that we sort of bridge people across race. And some of the questions that have animated this work have really been about trying to understand what I sort of think of as the North Star behind this, which is, how do we strengthen the capacity of organizations all over the world to act what Tocqueville used to call as the great free schools of democracy? And one of the things that I've learned, both from my own research but also from my work in politics, is that the idea that, as humans, we are not born, right, with the capacities for what it takes to engage in democratic society, but instead, those capacities are cultivated. And that's why these great free schools, like the Agora, are so important to us. And so, to give you a glimpse a little bit of some of the work that I've done, I just wanted to sort of introduce one study. So this is a study that I did starting in the kind of like mid-2000s or something like that. And it began with a paradox that I was seeing, or that a lot of us were seeing all over the world. And so here's the paradox. On the one hand, it felt like we had the rise of these new digital technologies that were making possible more participation than ever before, right? It was easier than it ever had been before to get hundreds of thousands of people to take action, right? But at the same time, as I was talking to people who are on the front lines of the organizations that were leading that kind of work, they were saying, it is true, right, that it's easier than it ever has been for us to get people involved, but we feel more powerless than ever before. Right? And so they pointed to stories like the Arab Spring, where with a Twitter handle and a Google Doc, they were able to get hundreds of thousands of people out into Tahrir Square to topple the Mubarak regime, right? But then a few years later, you fast forward, and the military is back in power. And I think it was that paradox that we were really trying to understand, which is, how is it that you get people involved in ways that not only get them to take action, but get them to take action to sort of build power over the things that they really care about? And so I set up a study. The study was in the United States, where we compared organizations that were really good at getting people involved, right, in the sustained ways that we were interested in, with organizations who weren't, right? And we were trying to think, even as these organizations are working with similar kinds of people, right, in similar kinds of communities, on similar kinds of issues, why is it that some of them are different from others, right? And so I don't want to spend too much time on the data or bore you too much this early in the morning, but basically what the graph on the left shows is that when we first started studying the people who were joining these organizations, in the beginning, their levels of political interest and their levels of participation were really quite similar to each other. Right? The people who joined were not that different from each other. But then we sort of followed them over a year, and what we found is that based on the kind of organization they joined, their level of participation really differed in a big way, right? People who joined organizations that happened to be these high engagement organizations were much more likely to have gotten involved and stay involved over time than people who didn't. And so that taught us sort of an important lesson, which really is about this idea that organizations, they're not just neutral repositories, right, for generating action, but in fact, they can make choices about how they want to engage people in public life. And those choices crucially determine the ways and the level at which people participate. And so just to describe an example of sort of what some of those choices are, I just want to tell you a story of a gentleman named Alex Waters. Okay, so Alex Waters, I don't know if any of you have heard of him because there's been a little bit of news about him in different circles, but Alex Waters grew up in the Midwest part of the United States. When he was younger, he thought he wanted to be a professional golfer. Right, so he went to college thinking he was going to be a professional athlete. And one weekend, he's at college. He went to school in Iowa. And one of his friends said, hey, you know, a bunch of us are going to go to my parents' lake house for the weekend. Do you want to come? And he thought, sure, right? I mean, when you're a college freshman, like, what could be better? I'm going to go to a friend's lake house for the weekend. So he goes off to this lake house with a bunch of his friends for the weekend. And one evening, he's standing at the end of the dock by a lake. Okay, and it's a little bit windy, and he's talking to some of his friends. He's got a baseball cap on. It's his favorite baseball cap. The wind comes by, and it blows the cap off his head into the water. And he thinks, shoot, I really love that baseball cap. What am I going to do, right? So he looks at the cap in the water, and he thinks, you know, a good baseball cap is really hard, right, to give up, right? Once it's formed to your head just right, you don't want to give it up. So I'm going to dive in the water, and I'm going to get that cap. And he thought the water was maybe 3 meters deep, right? But it turns out the water was not. It was probably more like half a meter deep. And so he dove into the water, right? And you can kind of imagine what happened next, right? He snapped his spinal cord. He ended up having to be life flighted out of there. And it took several years of rehab, right, for him to recover. He was quadriplegic, right? He was confined to a wheelchair after that. And you fast forward a few years, and he was back in college, but his life was very different at that point, right? Because his dreams of becoming a professional golfer had changed. And he was trying to think, okay, here I am back in college, but what is it that I want to do? Who is it that I want to be? And during that time, there was a young senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, who began to run for president. And some of you may know, Iowa is one of the states where presidential elections begin in a lot of ways. And so they were looking for field organizers around the United States. And the Obama campaign reached out to Alex, and they said, hey, we want to hire you as a field organizer. And Alex said, you want to hire me as a field organizer? I mean, I really like your guy, and I think he's great, and I hope he wins, but I can't be a field organizer. And they said, why? And he said, well, I can't do any of the things that field organizers do. And they said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I can't walk a neighborhood. I can't knock on doors. I can't dial phone numbers on a phone, right? I can't do any of the things that organizers are supposed to do. And the Obama campaign said, you know what? You're misunderstanding what we want organizers to do, right? What you're thinking about is a traditional campaign where what we do is we hire a bunch of 22-year-olds and we work them to the bone, right? Asking them to essentially become voter contact machines, right? Where all they're doing is in the months leading up to the election just spending, weeks and weeks of their time dialing phone numbers and knocking on doors and talking to every voter they possibly can. Right? They said, we're running a different kind of campaign. The campaign that we're going to run is one in which your job is not to constantly just reach out to and try to activate people who are already interested and engaged around Senator Obama, then Senator Obama, right? But in fact, your job, right, is to identify, recruit, and develop the leadership of people who live in the communities that you're organizing, cultivate their capacity to work with each other to begin to engage their neighbors in support for the president, right? And so it's neighbors talking to neighbors. And the difference really between what Alex thought he was going to do and what he ended up doing is one of the key differences that we found in our research, what we call the difference between sort of mobilizing and organizing, about what differentiates organizations that are consistently able to sort of speak into that paradox, right, and get people involved in the sustained ways that we want, that bridge across difference, that sort of get them involved over and over again from the organizations that weren't, right? And it was those kinds of choices that not only the Obama campaign, but lots of organizations that we've been able to study that have really helped us understand how it is that we can create organizations that make good choices about how we engage people, right? Because how we engage people matters, right? If we treat people like consumers, they're going to treat politics like cereal, right? But if we engage people as real agents, right, of democracy and cultivate their capacities, what we've found in working with organizations all over the world and on many different issues and across the political aisle is that there's a hunger that people have to want to engage in public life and in shaping their communities and their world in important ways. And so, the work that I do is really one part of, a much bigger set of questions that we're going to be looking at in the Agora Institute, right? I'm interested in this question of how we strengthen these Agora-like organizations to engage people in public life and deliberate in the ways that we want them to. But that's just, one part of what makes democracy work. I'm part of a commission at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on citizenship and democratic practice, and that commission, what it tried to do is bring together leading thinkers and practitioners, and elected officials and stakeholders from across the United States to try to understand how is it that we can rebuild, right, the foundations of democracy, not in a way that is partisan, but in a way that is about sort of restoring faith in the democratic process itself. And they argue, this commission argues, that there's sort of a virtuous cycle that can emerge between civil society, political institutions, and political culture. Now, we could debate about the words, right? Some people might say that it's a sort of virtuous society between the norms and the practices and the institutions of democracy. But I think what's the core of the idea, the kernel of the idea that there's this virtuous cycle that we can create, right, and strengthen to sort of make democracy resilient to the kind of threats that we see around the world is right. And that's part of the reason that I'm so excited about what we're going to be working on at the SNF Agora Institute. Because the Institute, as many of you know, is really about sort of doing work that is integrative in that way, that speaks to strengthening the foundations of that virtuous cycle that we're describing. And so the Institute is really built on this idea of 3 pillars, right? At the heart of it will be the academic anchor, right, where we hope to bring together world-class researchers, right, from a wide variety of disciplines who are thinking about this question of how we rebuild the foundations of democracy and doing work that is integrative across the sort of disciplines that people work in. But that's not going to be the only way that we're going to do work, right? We're also going to engage in the Agora labs, right? Where in the labs, we are putting the research and questions in partnership with stakeholders and communities of practice around the world. So often academic research can get siloed in its little, in its little towers, and academics are sitting at their computers, and every now and then they might write an op-ed that sort of gets those ideas out into the public. And I think part of the challenge that we want to engage is that when we start to think about our most complex problems about democracy, the challenges that we face are not just about information, about communicating the information out to people, but instead, it's about strategy, right? It's about asking people to work with us in partnership so that we can co-create solutions, right? And put those solutions into practice in the world. And that's what the Agora Labs hopes to do. And finally, through the Agora conversation, we hope to constantly be engaged in public dialogue, right? One of the great things that we can do is make sure that we bring a sound kind of intellectual sort of evidence-based view into some of the most complicated and divisive conversations that we have all over the world around the Agora, around questions of democracy. And so, I hope that through this work, we're able to do work that pushes the boundaries of creativity to their limits, right? Knowing that we might take risks, but that those risks are the kind of risks that we need to take to engage the world that we have right now, that we're able to sort of break down the silos that traditionally divide us, that we're able to sort of integrate research and practice, and bring data to bear on some of the most complicated and complex questions that we have before us. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity today to really begin this work in partnership with many of you who are here today. And the panels that we have before us today are really just the beginning of the kind of conversations that we hope to be exploring and scrutinizing and probing through the work of the Agora Institute.